100,000 men waited inside the strongest fortress in the Pacific. They had dug tunnels deep into volcanic rock. They had built 4 airfields and filled a harbor built to shelter an entire fleet. They trained every day for a battle they were told was coming. It never came. Not because America could not break through, because America decided it did not need to. For 2 years these men lived inside a silence that grew heavier. With every week no ship arrived, every plane that never returned, every officer's assurance that reinforcements were on the way. Slowly, without ever being told the truth outright, they understood. Their war had already ended somewhere else, without them. What happens to 100,000 soldiers when the enemy simply walks away? When the empire that sent them can no longer feed them, and the war moves on without a single shot fired at their gates? This is the story of the men history chose to forget while they were still very much alive, waiting for an invasion that America had already decided was not worth the cost. The volcano stood over the harbor like it was still deciding whether to finish what it had started. Rabaul sat on the tip of the Gazelle Peninsula, on the island of New Britain, wrapped around a body of water so deep and so sheltered that sailors who had crossed the entire Pacific called it one of the finest anchorages they had ever seen. Simpson Harbor could hold hundreds of warships at once, safe from the swells that battered every other coastline in the region. Behind it rose volcanic ridges cloaked in jungle so dense that a man could stand 30 feet from a machine gun nest and never know it was there. In January of 1942, this land belonged to Australia. A small garrison held the town, mostly untested troops, a scattering of coastal guns, and almost no air cover to speak of. Men who had been sent there expected months of quiet duty in a tropical backwater, not the opening act of a war that would define the rest of their lives. When the Japanese invasion force arrived before dawn on the 23rd, it did not arrive as a rumor or a warning. It arrived as an overwhelming fact, ships filling the harbor mouth in numbers no lookout on that coast had ever been trained to expect, aircraft crossing the ridgeline in formations that blotted out sections of the pale morning sky, thousands of soldiers coming ashore before the defenders could organize a response that meant anything. The sound alone would have told the defenders everything they needed to know: engines overhead, boots on volcanic sand, orders shouted in a language most of them had never heard spoken in anger. The Australians fought where they could and ran where they had to. Within hours, the flag over Rabaul had changed. Within days, the garrison that had held it was scattered through the jungle, trying to survive long enough to escape an island that had just changed hands forever, moving through undergrowth that offered cover but no food, no maps, and no certainty that anyone was coming to pull them out. For the men who took it, Rabaul was not simply a captured town. It was a gift they had not fully understood until they stood on its shores and looked at what nature had already built for them. A harbor deep enough for a battle fleet, ridgelines that turned every approach into a corridor a handful of defenders could hold against thousands, volcanic soil that could be tunneled into like clay, hardening into shelters that no bomb dropped from those years of the war could crack open. Japanese commanders sent word back to Tokyo within weeks. This was not a position to garrison lightly. This was a position to build into something no one could take from them again. What followed over the next 18 months was construction on a scale that few places in the empire outside the home islands themselves would ever see. 4 airfields rose from cleared jungle, each one capable of handling squadrons of fighters and bombers, each one positioned so that no single American strike could knock out Japanese air power in one blow. Engineers began cutting into the volcanic rock that ringed the harbor, and what started as bunkers for ammunition grew into something closer to a buried city. Corridors wide enough for trucks, chambers deep enough to shelter aircraft engines being repaired by lantern light, while the war outside went on without them. Men worked in shifts around the clock, stripped to the waist in the heat, hauling baskets of broken rock out of tunnel mouths that seemed to multiply every time a supply ship arrived with fresh drilling equipment. The air inside those early chambers stayed thick with dust and the smell of oil lamps, and the sound of picks against stone became as familiar to the men stationed there as the sound of the surf. Coastal batteries were sited to cover every channel a ship could use to enter the harbor. Anti-aircraft guns went up in numbers so dense that American bomber crews who flew missions over the target began speaking of it in a different tone than they used for anywhere else in the theater, describing skies over Rabaul thick enough with tracer fire and bursting shells that a man could believe for a moment the air itself had turned solid. Rabaul was not just defended. It was becoming a fortress that seemed to grow harder every month anyone looked at it. A place where the jungle itself had been turned into a weapon, where every ridge concealed a gun and every hillside hid a door into the rock that no map issued to an American pilot would ever fully show. By the middle of 1943, close to 100,000 men called Rabaul home. Soldiers of the 8th Area Army under General Hitoshi Imamura filled the barracks and the hillside camps. Naval aviators under Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka flew from the airfields and briefed in bunkers carved into the same rock that sheltered their planes. Construction troops, medical staff, supply clerks, cooks, engineers, all of them together made Rabaul the largest concentration of Japanese military power anywhere outside of the war in China. It had become, in the space of a year and a half, the anchor of everything Japan was trying to hold in the southwestern Pacific. Every convoy bound for the Solomon Islands moved through waters Rabaul protected. Every air campaign over New Guinea drew support from squadrons based on its runways. If a man in Tokyo needed to point at a single place on the map and say, "Here is where our strength in this region lives," his finger would land on Rabaul. Which is exactly why American planners spent the first half of 1943 trying to figure out how to take it away from them. The early version of the plan looked the way most plans against a fortress like this looked on paper. Advance along the coast of New Guinea, clear the surrounding islands one at a time, and eventually put enough force in position to storm Rabaul directly, the way an army was supposed to remove an enemy stronghold sitting in its path. General Douglas MacArthur had built that plan himself. Rabaul had always sat at the center of it, the objective everything else was meant to lead toward. Then the casualty reports from the fighting already underway in the Solomons started to accumulate on the desks of the men who had to authorize what came next. And the arithmetic of a direct assault on Rabaul stopped looking like something any sane commander could recommend without flinching. Elsewhere in the Pacific, American forces were already learning what a heavily defended position, even a tiny one, could cost in a single battle. A fortified atoll, barely large enough to walk across in an afternoon, had taken a bloody toll on the Marines who stormed it in a matter of hours, and the men reading those reports understood exactly what that meant when the target in question was not a strip of coral, but an entire fortified peninsula. This was not a small island with a short beach and a few hundred defenders dug into sand. This was a position with 100,000 men behind coastal guns, buried air defenses, and terrain that favored every rifle pointed at the men coming ashore. Military planners who ran the numbers on what it would take to break that kind of position by force were not looking at a short, hard fight. They were looking at months of grinding combat in jungle and volcanic rock, against defenders who had spent 18 months preparing for exactly this moment, with losses that would be measured in a currency no commander wanted to spend if there was any other way to win the war. There was another way. It had not been official policy yet, not in the summer of 1943, but the evidence for it was already sitting in front of the men who would eventually have to choose. American submarines and aircraft had spent months proving that a modern industrial power could strangle supply lines from a distance, without ever setting a boot on the shore of the target itself. Naval and air power, applied with patience and without letting up, could turn a fortress into a trap for the very men who had built it strong enough to survive a direct assault. The question was no longer whether Rabaul could be taken. American commanders increasingly believed it could be, at a price. The real question was whether taking it was even necessary anymore. In August of 1943, Allied leaders gathered in Quebec to settle exactly that question, and what came out of those meetings marked one of the sharpest departures from conventional military thinking of the entire war in the Pacific. MacArthur himself was the man who argued against his own earlier plan. 100,000 Japanese soldiers sealed inside a fortress with no fuel for their aircraft, no ships able to resupply them safely, and no path to reinforce anyone else in the theater were not, in his revised judgment, a threat that required destruction. They were a burden Japan would be forced to carry for the rest of the war, 100,000 mouths to feed, 100,000 men Tokyo would have to worry about and could never use, sealed away from every battle that would actually decide how the war ended. The Joint Chiefs approved the change. Rabaul would not be stormed. It would be isolated, strangled by air and sea power tightening around it a little more each month, and then left behind entirely as the war moved past it toward targets that mattered more. The decision was written into planning documents, discussed in rooms with maps on the walls and coffee going cold on the table, and filed away as one line among many in a war that had 1,000 fronts to manage. No one told the garrison. Somewhere among those 100,000 men, soldiers were still hauling ammunition into freshly cut tunnels. Gun crews were still drilling on coastal batteries aimed at a fleet that had already been quietly told not to come. And officers were still briefing their men on the invasion everyone assumed was only a matter of time, an invasion that existed now only in the minds of the men waiting for it. In a conference room thousands of miles away, that invasion had just been quietly, permanently, canceled. The men inside the fortress they had spent a year and a half building with their own hands would not learn that for a long time, and when they finally did understand it, it would not arrive as an announcement, a signal, or a surrender demand shouted across the wire. It would arrive slowly, the way a tide goes out, one absence at a time, until the water was gone and no one could say exactly when it had left. The isolation of Rabaul was not a single event that anyone inside the fortress could point to afterward and say, that was the day everything changed. It was a slow tightening, a series of losses so gradual that a man could go weeks without noticing how much smaller his world had become, until one morning he looked around and realized the war he had trained for no longer had any use for him. It came in 3 stages, and each one took something different away from the men who had built Rabaul into the strongest position in the region. The first stage was the sky. Beginning in late 1943, American and Australian aircraft flew mission after mission against the airfields that had made Rabaul a threat to the entire surrounding theater. The bombers were not trying to flatten the fortress itself. Everyone involved understood that the tunnels and bunkers carved into the volcanic rock could absorb almost anything dropped on them with the weapons available at the time. The real target was smaller and more specific, the aircraft that gave Rabaul its teeth, the fighters and bombers that could still reach out and strike at American ships and troops elsewhere in the region. Through November of 1943, the fighting in the skies above the harbor reached an intensity that surprised veterans on both sides, wave after wave of interceptors rising to meet formations that kept coming regardless of losses. Japanese losses in those weeks were severe enough that the combined fleet made the difficult decision to pull its carrier air groups out of Rabaul entirely, rather than watch them be ground down to nothing defending a fixed position. By February of 1944, the airfields were still there, the runways still intact, the revetments still standing, but there was almost nothing left to fly from them. A fortress with 4 airfields and no meaningful air power is a fortress that has already lost the only thing that made it dangerous to the men trying to bypass it. The second stage came from beneath the water. American submarines had spent the war learning how to find and destroy the ships that kept Japan's island garrisons alive, and by the time Rabaul needed that supply line the most, the hunters had gotten very good at their job. Transports and destroyers that tried to run the passage to Rabaul found the waters around it growing more dangerous with every month, picked off by submarines lurking along the routes, harassed by aircraft that had once had to fight for control of the sky and now flew with something close to freedom. A convoy that might once have counted on losing 1 ship in 10 now counted itself fortunate to arrive with half its vessels intact, and captains who volunteered for the run to Rabaul knew, in a way they rarely spoke of openly, that they were being asked to gamble their crews against odds that grew worse with every passing month. Ships that made it through arrived carrying only a fraction of what the garrison actually needed, and even that fraction came at a cost in vessels and crews that Japan could not keep paying. By the middle of 1944, the flow of supplies into Rabaul had shrunk to something closer to a trickle than a lifeline, arriving unpredictably, in smaller amounts, with no guarantee that the next attempt would make it through at all. Dock workers at Simpson Harbor grew accustomed to unloading a single battered freighter and understanding, without being told, that whatever came off its deck that day would have to stretch across weeks it was never meant to cover. The third stage did not require a single shot fired at Rabaul itself. It was simply geography, and it was perhaps the cruelest of the three because it asked nothing of the Japanese defenders and required no battle to complete. As American forces advanced up the coast of New Guinea and through the island chains of the Solomons, they did not move toward Rabaul. They moved around it, seizing airfields and harbors that let them leap past Japanese strongpoints entirely rather than grinding through them one by one. Every advance elsewhere in the theater pushed Rabaul further behind the line of fighting, not because anyone had come closer to it, but because the war itself had relocated, leaving the fortress sitting in a pocket of ocean and jungle that no longer connected to anything either side considered important. The 100,000 men inside Rabaul did not receive this news all at once, and they did not receive it honestly. What they experienced instead was a slow accumulation of small, unexplained absences, each one open to a dozen different interpretations, none of which anyone in a position of authority was willing to confirm. General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding the 8th Area Army from his headquarters at Rabaul, understood the shape of what was happening well before most of the men under him. By the middle of 1944, the picture available to him and to the senior officers around him was clear enough in its outline even if the exact timeline remained uncertain. The airfields had been neutralized in every sense that mattered operationally. The harbor, though physically undamaged, no longer supported anything resembling offensive naval activity. The flow of supplies was shrinking in a way that no amount of local improvisation could fully offset over the long term. Imamura had built his career and his understanding of duty inside a military culture that did not easily accommodate telling soldiers the unvarnished truth about a hopeless strategic position, especially when that truth might be read as an admission of failure at the very top of the chain that had sent them there. So the men under his command were told a different story. They were told that Rabaul was holding a position of great importance to the empire's overall strategy. They were told that reinforcement and resupply were being planned and would arrive when conditions allowed it. They were told, in effect, to keep waiting, to keep training, to keep believing that the invasion they had spent a year and a half preparing for was still coming, just delayed, just a matter of patience. What the men could see with their own eyes told a different story than the one their officers were giving them. The supply ships that used to arrive on something like a schedule stopped coming with any predictability at all. The aircraft on the runways thinned out not overnight but over the course of weeks, planes flying off and simply not being replaced, ground crews left standing beside empty revetments with nothing left to service. The air raids that had once come almost daily grew infrequent, then rare, then almost stopped entirely, not because the Americans had decided to spare the garrison any further punishment, but because there was nothing left inside Rabaul worth the fuel and the risk it would take to hit it again. Each of these small observations became a piece of a larger picture that ordinary soldiers assembled quietly among themselves, comparing notes in mess halls and along tunnel corridors, arriving independently at conclusions that none of their officers were willing to state out loud. A man who had once counted the days until the invasion arrived, certain that battle would come and certain that he understood roughly when, found himself instead counting empty revetments and unfamiliar silences, building a private timeline out of absences rather than events. There was no single conversation where the truth was spoken aloud between an officer and the men he commanded. There were only glances exchanged when a supply ship failed to appear on the day it was expected, and the particular quiet that settled over a barracks when men had run out of ways to explain a pattern they all recognized but none of them could confirm. By the end of 1944, most of the garrison understood, in the way men understand things they are never told directly, that something fundamental had shifted in their situation, and that no one above them intended to say so plainly. Understanding the shift was one problem. Surviving it was another, and the second problem came with a set of numbers that no amount of morale or discipline could argue away. A Japanese soldier in the field needed a baseline amount of food from military rations alone just to remain minimally functional, a figure that assumed supplementation from whatever local sources were available. Multiply that basic requirement across 100,000 men, and the fortress needed an enormous, continuous flow of food simply to keep its population alive at even a reduced level of health, day after day, for as long as the isolation lasted. The supply ships slipping through the American blockade in 1944 were delivering only a small portion of that requirement. The volcanic soil of the Rabaul Peninsula, worked hard enough, could supplement the shortfall, but could not come close to closing the gap on its own, not without an effort that went far beyond anything the garrison had originally been organized or trained to provide. The mathematics were unforgiving. Left as it was, at its original strength and its original rate of consumption, the garrison faced a slow decline into starvation, long before the war around it showed any sign of ending. Rations that had once included fish, rice, and preserved meat in something resembling regular portions shrank steadily, first in variety, then in size, until a meal that had once been unremarkable became something men noticed and remembered, and, eventually, something they measured their days by. Officers who had never in their careers been asked to think about caloric requirements found themselves doing exactly that, sitting with supply clerks and medical staff trying to work out how many weeks a given stock of rice could stretch across a garrison that size, and what would happen to the men's strength, and eventually their ability to work the fields at all, if the answer kept coming back worse than the month before. What the men of Rabaul did next has received far less attention than it deserves, because it does not fit easily into the kind of story the Pacific War is usually told as. Faced with a problem that no infantry tactics manual addressed, the garrison turned itself, in large part, into a farm. Entire battalions that had trained for combined arms warfare were reassigned to agricultural labor as their primary duty rather than an occasional task. Officers who had spent years studying artillery placement and infantry maneuver found themselves spending their days supervising the planting and harvesting of sweet potatoes, taro, and whatever other crops the volcanic ground could be coaxed into producing. Soldiers who had trained to operate landing craft and patrol boats repurposed those same vessels for fishing, working the waters around the peninsula for whatever protein the sea could still provide. Men built irrigation channels by hand, terraced hillsides that had never grown anything but jungle, and raised pigs and chickens in numbers substantial enough that parts of what had been one of the most heavily fortified military bases outside Japan itself began to resemble, from a distance, a farming settlement more than an army garrison. The engineering skill that had gone into building tunnels and airfields and coastal gun emplacements was redirected toward building the irrigation systems, storage facilities, and food processing operations that could keep this many men alive on a fraction of the supply they had once counted on. The scale of the effort was staggering once it took hold. Fields spread across hillsides that had been thick jungle only months before, worked by men who had never farmed a day in their lives before the war put a shovel in their hands instead of a rifle. Fishing fleets made up of repurposed landing craft went out before dawn and returned in the afternoon heat, with whatever the surrounding waters would give up, salted and dried in quantities meant to last through the leaner weeks that everyone now assumed were coming. Storehouses that had once held ammunition and aviation fuel were repurposed to hold sacks of sweet potatoes and dried fish, guarded now not against sabotage but against the much simpler threat of men growing desperate enough to steal from their own supply lines. Nothing about this transformation had been planned for in the doctrine any of these men had trained under, and every part of it had to be invented, adjusted, and rebuilt as the garrison learned, through trial and failure, exactly how much 100,000 men could coax out of volcanic soil and a stretch of tropical coastline. This was not a military operation in any sense the men who built Rabaul's defenses had ever trained for. It was closer to the construction of an entire self-sufficient society, assembled under pressure, by men who had not chosen this task and had no guarantee it would be enough. Whether that improvised society could hold together long enough for the war to end, one way or another, was a question entirely outside their control, dependent on decisions being made in rooms none of them would ever see, by men who had already decided that Rabaul no longer mattered to the outcome. Life inside the fortress during these years took on a character that the men who survived it struggled to describe honestly even decades later, because so much of it contradicted what they had expected war to look like when they first arrived. They were soldiers stationed in a fortress that no longer served any military purpose. They were members of a garrison technically still at war, yet unable to conduct a single meaningful offensive operation, and with no prospect of ever doing so again. They were subjects of an empire that continued to tell them they were fighting for national survival, while providing them, month by month, with less and less of what survival actually required. Senior officers tried to preserve the outward forms of military life wherever they could, holding unit formations, running training exercises that had no operational purpose beyond keeping men occupied, conducting inspections with the same formality they would have used in a fully functioning army. Part of this was practical. Structure and routine helped hold off the kind of psychological collapse that could spread quickly through large groups of men left with no clear purpose and no end in sight. Part of it was institutional. Maintaining the appearance of a combat-ready force was consistent with the official position, repeated up and down the chain of command, that Rabaul's isolation was a temporary condition rather than a permanent sentence. Beneath that official routine, something else was growing, an informal culture shaped entirely by the demands of survival rather than the traditions of military hierarchy. Units that had been organized around combat function reorganized themselves, in practice if not on paper, around the requirements of farming, fishing, and communal survival, cutting across boundaries that would never have been crossed in a functioning combat army. Relationships between officers and enlisted men shifted under the weight of shared hardship, in ways that no training manual anticipated and no peacetime hierarchy would have permitted. Men from branches of service that had almost no reason to interact under normal circumstances. Army infantry standing beside naval aviators, construction engineers working alongside medical staff, found themselves side by side on the same vegetable plots and fishing boats and building projects, developing a kind of practical dependence on one another that circumstance had created and no order from above had ever intended. An officer who had spent his career giving orders to infantrymen might spend an afternoon taking instruction from a former farmer turned private on how deep to set a row of taro, and neither man treated the reversal as anything worth remarking on out loud, because the ground they stood on no longer cared about rank in the way a battlefield did. Evenings brought their own quiet rituals, men gathering around cooking fires to share whatever the day's fishing or harvest had produced, trading stories about homes many of them had not seen in years, measuring time now by planting seasons and tide charts rather than by any calendar tied to the war they had once expected to fight. It was a strange kind of community, built entirely out of necessity, populated by men who had arrived as strangers from a dozen different units and found themselves, against every expectation of military life, becoming neighbors instead. The garrison also built its own quiet channel of information about the world beyond its perimeter, assembled from whatever fragments made it through the isolation. Men watched the pattern of American aircraft passing overhead and tried to read meaning into their numbers, their altitude, their direction. Radio operators intercepted transmissions they were not always able to fully decode, but could sometimes place well enough to guess at what they meant. Occasionally, a piece of reliable information slipped through the blockade, along with a supply shipment, carried by a sailor or an officer who had seen more of the wider war than the men trapped at Rabaul had any chance to see for themselves. None of it added up to a complete picture, but it was enough, pieced together carefully over months, to tell the men inside the fortress that the war was continuing to move, at a pace and across distances that had almost nothing to do with them anymore. That impression was correct, and the scale of what was happening outside Rabaul while its garrison farmed and fished and waited would have been almost impossible for any of them to fully grasp from inside the perimeter. General MacArthur's forces continued leapfrogging along the New Guinea coast through a string of amphibious landings that seized key airfields and supply points while deliberately avoiding the larger concentrations of Japanese troops wherever possible, applying the same logic that had spared Rabaul to position after position across the theater, but moving at a pace the Japanese defensive network had no way to answer. Hollandia fell in April of 1944. The Vogelkop Peninsula was secured by July. By October, American forces stood ready to begin the return to the Philippines. Each of these operations was another step in a campaign moving further away from Rabaul with every month, and another quiet confirmation that the 100,000 men still waiting inside its tunnels had less and less bearing on how the war would actually end. At the same time, Admiral Nimitz drove a separate campaign directly across the center of the Pacific, through the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, and the Carolines, a sequence of operations that pushed American air power steadily closer to the Philippines and eventually to Japan itself. The garrisons that had been bypassed along the way, Rabaul among them, along with positions like Truk and Wewak, were simply left in place, their strategic relevance shrinking with each American advance, their supply situation deteriorating in step with the collapse of Japan's maritime shipping under relentless submarine pressure. These garrisons had become, in the coldest sense of military planning, irrelevant, kept alive or allowed to starve according to circumstances that had nothing to do with anything happening inside their own perimeters. Rabaul watched this unfold from its isolated position through the only window available to it, the aircraft its lookouts could occasionally spot passing high overhead. By later in the war, some of those aircraft were unmistakable even at a distance, enormous four-engine bombers flying at altitudes that put them well beyond the reach of whatever anti-aircraft capability the garrison still had left. These were the B-29s, flying missions that had nothing to do with Rabaul at all, bound for targets in the Philippines and eventually for Japan itself. For the men watching them cross the sky far above their heads, the sight was more honest than anything their officers had told them in the past year. It was visible proof that the decisive fighting of the war had relocated entirely, to a theater the garrison could see but never reach, separated from them not by distance alone but by a set of decisions, made in rooms thousands of miles away, that could not be undone or appealed by anyone still waiting inside the fortress for a battle that had already been canceled without their knowledge. All that remained for the men of Rabaul was to keep farming, keep fishing, keep maintaining the forms of an army that no longer had a war left to fight, and to wait for an ending that would arrive, whenever it finally came, on terms none of them would have any part in deciding. Through the first half of 1945, the war that had left Rabaul behind moved toward its own conclusion at a pace the garrison could only guess at from fragments. The B-29s kept crossing the sky at altitudes no gun on the peninsula could reach, more of them with each passing month, until their presence became so routine that men barely looked up anymore. Radio operators picked pieces out of the air, place names that meant something to men who still remembered a map of the Pacific from before their isolation began, fragments of transmissions that hinted at battles being fought on islands closer and closer to Japan itself. None of it was confirmed, none of it was explained by anyone with the authority to explain it. The garrison kept planting, kept fishing, kept holding its formations and its inspections, because there was nothing else to do with a war that had made itself invisible to the very men still technically fighting it. Then, in August of 1945, word arrived through official channels that could not be dismissed as rumor or wishful interpretation of a half-heard broadcast. Japan had surrendered. The war that the garrison at Rabaul had spent more than 2 years waiting to rejoin was over, decided in full by events that had taken place thousands of miles from the fortress they had built with their own hands, and then watched become irrelevant. Men who had spent 2 years farming volcanic hillsides and mending fishing nets now found themselves trying to absorb news that arrived with none of the ceremony they might once have imagined for the end of a war. There was no final battle to look back on. No moment of victory or defeat they had witnessed directly. There was only an order passed down through the chain of command, confirming what most of them had already suspected for the better part of a year, that the fighting itself had ended somewhere else, without them, exactly the way everything else about their war had unfolded from a distance they were never permitted to close. General Imamura received the order and complied with it. There was no resistance. No attempt to argue that the garrison could fight on regardless of what had happened elsewhere. No gesture of defiance from 100,000 men who had spent 2 years being told their position mattered to the empire's survival. In September of 1945, Imamura formally surrendered the Rabaul garrison to Australian forces in a ceremony conducted with the full formality that Japanese military tradition demanded, regardless of the circumstances that had brought the garrison to this point. Australian officers who were present that day later described something that surprised many of them going in. The Japanese troops on parade maintained their bearing and their discipline throughout the proceedings, standing in formation with the same order and precision that might have been expected of a garrison that had spent its 2 years of isolation training for exactly this kind of ceremony, rather than fighting simply to keep itself fed. Whatever the isolation years had done to these men, and it had done a great deal, it had not broken the discipline that had held them together as an organized force from the first day of their confinement to the last. The physical condition of the men who stood in that formation told a more complete story than any official report could have. Of the roughly 100,000 men who had been present at Rabaul when the garrison was at its peak strength, a meaningful number did not live to see the surrender, lost over 2 years to tropical disease, to the slow toll of an inadequate diet even after the agricultural program reached its full scale, and to the intermittent air attacks that had never entirely stopped even as they grew rarer through the isolation period. The men who did survive to surrender showed the visible effects of years spent on a restricted diet and constant physical labor in the fields and on the water. And yet the outcome at Rabaul, grim as it was, compared favorably to what happened at some of the other Japanese garrisons that the same strategy of isolation had left stranded across the Pacific. Positions that lacked Rabaul's agricultural capacity, or the volcanic soil and coastal waters that made large-scale farming and fishing possible, suffered losses to starvation and disease on a scale that made Rabaul's survival rate look, by grim comparison, like something close to success. The improvised farming society the garrison had built out of desperation had done exactly what it needed to do. It had kept most of them alive long enough to see the war end. What followed the surrender was not a single dramatic moment, but a long, unglamorous process that took months to complete. Moving 100,000 men off an island that the war had deliberately chosen to bypass required substantial logistical effort from Australian and eventually American forces, effort that had to be organized and executed in the middle of a region still recovering from years of fighting elsewhere. Ships had to be found, schedules had to be built, and the men who had spent 2 years learning to survive on Rabaul's own resources now had to be fed, processed, and transported back toward a homeland that most of them had not seen since before the isolation began. The Japan these men returned to was not the Japan they remembered leaving. The empire that had sent them to hold Rabaul as a strategic outpost of enormous importance no longer existed in any form its former soldiers would recognize. The emperor, in whose name every official assurance about reinforcement and relief had been issued, had announced an unconditional surrender that ended the war these men had trained their entire adult lives to fight. Cities they had known before the war greeted them, in many cases, as burned-out shells, and families who had waited years for word of sons and husbands stationed at a fortress few of them had ever heard mentioned in the news, now had to reconcile the men who came home, thinner and older than their years, with the soldiers who had left for a war that newspapers at the time had described as an unstoppable advance. The 100,000 men who had waited at Rabaul for an invasion that never came went home to a country that was only beginning to understand, in its own halting and painful way, exactly what had happened to it over the course of the war, and that process of understanding would take considerably longer than the journey home from New Britain. The story of Rabaul's isolated garrison deserves to be remembered as more than a strange footnote buried inside the larger narrative of the Pacific War. It stands as a case study in one of the most significant strategic shifts of the 20th century, and in the human cost that shift imposed on the men who found themselves on the losing end of a calculation they never had any say in making. The decision to bypass Rabaul rather than storm it represented a genuine break from the military doctrine that had governed warfare for generations. The assumption that a strong, fortified position sitting on your flank or behind your line of advance had to be reduced by direct assault before an army could safely move past it. What Rabaul proved, at a cost measured in years rather than hours, was that sustained air and naval pressure could achieve the same strategic result as a direct assault, at a fraction of the human cost to the attacking side, provided the attacker was willing to accept a slower timeline and the discomfort of leaving a large enemy force alive and intact behind advancing lines. The 100,000 men of the Rabaul garrison were never defeated in the way soldiers expect to be defeated. There was no climactic battle, no final assault they could point to and say, "This is where we lost." They were made irrelevant instead, quietly and gradually, by decisions made in a conference room they never saw, and irrelevance turned out to be a harder thing to live with than defeat, because it offered no single moment of resolution, and no clear point at which the outcome became something a man could simply accept and move past. The soldiers who farmed and fished and stood their formations and watched American bombers cross the sky toward a war they were no longer part of understood something that the men who had designed the strategy around them could only grasp from a distance, through planning documents and casualty projections that never had to account for what the decision actually felt like to the people living inside its consequences. They had become, without asking for the role and without any way to refuse it, proof that an idea worked, an idea that would go on to shape how militaries thought about siege and blockade and the value of a fortified position for the rest of the century. The price of being that proof was paid entirely by the men who waited inside Rabaul's perimeter, measured out over 2 years of hunger, isolation, and the slow, unspoken realization that the battle they had trained for was never coming. They had no vote in the decision that placed them there, and no way out of it until a war that had already forgotten them finally ended, on terms decided entirely by someone else. 100,000 Japanese soldiers waited at Rabaul. They built a fortress that no assault could have taken easily. They held their discipline through 2 years of isolation that broke lesser organized forces apart entirely. They turned volcanic soil into farmland to keep themselves alive long enough to see the end of a war that had already decided, without telling them, that they no longer mattered to how it would finish. Nobody came, not because America could not have come, but because America had already decided that 100,000 men sealed inside a fortress with nowhere to go and nothing left to fight with were worth more to Japan as a burden than they would ever be worth as an enemy on a battlefield. The men who made that calculation in a conference room in Quebec turned out to be right. The men who lived inside the consequences of that calculation paid for it being right with 2 years of their lives, waiting behind the strongest walls in the Pacific for a war that the world outside had already moved on without them.